today we're welcoming for the first time Rebecca Usherwood. So she is assistant professor in the Department of Classics at Trinity College, and the first speaker we've had from the Department of Classics. No pressure.
Hopefully not the last.
Definitely not the last. Definitely not the last. And her research focuses on imperial ideology and how it was understood by those who lived in the Roman Empire. She's published especially on the emperors Constantine and somebody else's name I can't pronounce.
It's music.
Including a book, Political Memory and the Constantinian Dynasty, which traces the ways in which emperors might be understood as disgraced after they've been overthrown. She works as a historical consultant for film and the museum sector and was advisor for the Sky TV series Domina from 2021 to 23. So you're very welcome, and thanks very much, Rebecca, for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
Who here has watched a film or a TV series set in the historical past, say 100 years or more ago? Show of hands. Lots and lots of people. What about, say, like 400 years or more ago? Yeah? A medieval? Yeah? What about the ancient world? Fewer and fewer as we go further in the past, which is fair enough. What about books? Does anyone read what we call like historical fiction? So novels, fictional novels set in the past. Yeah? Oh, smiles, okay. Who here just actively enjoys this kind of content? Like you will search out, if you see a new, like Netflix has got a new TV series on the Tudors or something, you'll be like, that's for me, I am interested in that. Okay. Can anyone like volunteer like why? Why is it that you're like, this is what does it for me? I don't wanna see stuff in the 20th century or 21st century. I want to see something in the past world. Yeah?
Similar people, but in a very different context.
Okay. Yeah? So the idea that they're humans just like us,
Yes.
but it's in a different world.
It's enough distance for us to see maybe patterns and how people behave in a context that is unfamiliar to us, but also sort of shows us how similar those people are to us in many ways, as monsters, as heroes, as visionaries, or as
It's very eloquently
put.
Okay, so it's the idea of them being real people who are motivated by real things. Yeah, okay. Does anyone have a particular example of something that maybe had like a seminal impact on them, that you watched it when you were younger and you were like, this film, this TV series this got me into this particular topic? Yeah?
Well, one that I watched not too long ago, but I thought was terrific, was Wolf Hall.
It's a big love. I love Wolf Hall. Hilary Mantel. Yeah, Wolf Hall. Why? What was it about?
Gosh, it was everything about it. It was real people in different situations, as the gentleman said, but court intrigue and I suppose things that were the norm then that would be horrific now, so I suppose situations of great interest.
So you get these moments where you're like, these people are behaving like how we behave, and then you get these moments where it kind of drops and you're like, this is barbaric, this is completely unlike.
You're completely aghast at.
Yeah, and Wolf Hall famously both a book and a TV series now in 3 seasons now, I think it is. So historical fiction. So I'm a historian, so it's kind of unsurprising that historical fiction is like my favourite genre to read. One I read recently was Maggie O'Farrell's The Marriage Portrait. Absolutely loved it because it kind of, it was a familiar context of 16th century Italy, but it was inhabiting the world of a young girl, a young woman in that context, seeing the world through her eyes, that it was both familiar and quite distant. I love TV and films set in the past. Most recently, the one I watched was Barry Lyndon. I was a bit late to that. Yeah, they had a rescreening of that. Absolutely loved that. And again, what I love so much about it is it brings the past to life. So it reminds us, and this is really important for me as a historian, is that the past isn't just a set of problems to solve. It isn't like, why did the Roman Empire fall? It is real people. It changes it around. It makes us think, what was it like to be a human living in this time period? And I especially was always being drawn to female characters because I can sort of, they resonate with me. I can see myself in that context and reflect on how my life and how the opportunities given to me would have been different 400, 500, 600 years ago. So I'm a historian of ancient Rome, and for this reason I usually avoid anything set in the ancient world. So I do not often read novels set in the ancient world or watch TV set in the ancient world just because it's too close to home, it's too close to my day job. I do enjoy watching it sometimes, so I'm not sure how many people here watched the second Gladiator film when it came. Oh, lots of people shaking their head resolutely, like absolutely avoided that. Yeah, you watched it? I really enjoyed watching it for what it was. I did go with my friend who is also a Roman historian, and there was some sort of pearl clutching moments where we were sitting there in the audience and they said something and we were like, but I could like appreciate it for what it was, that it was visually superb, etc. Less sharks in the arena, not something that happened. But when I was younger, I loved consuming stuff set in ancient Rome, and it was one of the reasons why I ended up being a Roman historian. So while I was at school, when I was an undergraduate, I was a little too young for I, Claudius. Has anyone here seen I, Claudius from the 70s? Yeah. So this was the BBC. It's, again, like Wolf Hall. It's set based on a novel, 2 novels by Robert Graves. And I was a little too young for this, but I did watch it later when I was already in uni. And then there's Gladiator. So this is the one which really in the last sort of 25 years took Rome to sort of center stage. And I was also slightly too young for this, slightly too young. I'm, as you can probably hear, from the UK. I'm from London. And it was a 15 certificate in the UK, and I was like 2 or 3 years too young to watch it, though I did remember my parents went on a date to see it. And they told me that there was a standing ovation at the end of it. And knowing nothing about the Romans at the time, I remember when I eventually watched it on VHS, a few years later, I said to my dad, like, did they restore the Republic? And he was like, no, they didn't restore the Republic. So for my generation, HBO Rome was the big one. Has anyone watched HBO Rome? I think it's going to have a renaissance. It's 20 years old now. We're really big into box sets on streaming services. So I think this is going to come back and be rediscovered. So this came out. The first season came out in 2005. This was just before I went to uni, and the second season came out a couple of years later when I was in uni, and it was like revolutionary for me and my classmates who were studying the ancient world at the time. And, we were obsessed with the ancient world, and I was feeling nostalgic. So yesterday I texted all my friends from uni who are now doing lots of different things. I'm the only one who's still, like, doing this stuff. And I said, like, what was it about HBO Rome that we loved so much? And I got so many good answers from them. I wrote some of them down now. That it was the mixture of historical figures and everyday people. So there were people that we heard about, so Julius Caesar, the Emperor Augustus, and they were turned into real people. But there were also people who maybe only have like a tiny reference in the historical sources. So a big one here are these 2 characters here. So there were Lucius Vorenus and Titus Pullo. And these, we have like a tiny reference to them in a literary source. They mention them, and they constructed all sort of whole characters around the usage of, normal legionary soldiers. So not the generals, not the aristocrats. What was it like for the normal soldiers? And then also, particularly for the female characters, and we'll come back to this in a second, but how do you flesh out these people we hear only passing references to as like real people and anti-heroes in most cases? And this was the really sort of memorable ones. So we have Polly Walker, who did Atia, who was the future Emperor Augustus's mum, who we have the tiniest reference to in historical source. And they constructed this amazing sort of anti-heroine character. And then we have Kerry Condon, a very young Kerry Condon here, playing Octavia, who is the elder sister of the future Emperor Augustus. And this was, a real big thing. And one aspect we liked about it as well was it just didn't look like Gladiator. So Gladiator is what we'd looked at, and it was this big, white, shining marble Rome. And this was dirty Rome. It looked smelly. There was graffiti. There was violence. There was sex. There was gore. It felt familiar. It felt relatable, but it also felt really different. And it really revolutionized what the ancient world on film looked like. It wasn't this. So this was it was a really big thing for us. But unfortunately, it didn't wind down properly. And there's just partly, and I'll come back to this, because of what it means to put the past on film. And the key thing here is it is extremely expensive. It's a really expensive thing to do on TV and film, more expensive than other kind of productions. And they had planned out a whole sort of sweep of several seasons. And instead what happened is they did a full first season, and the second season kind of compressed a huge amount of stuff and kind of fizzled out. And this was partly because, basically it was seen as extremely expensive, and it's 2007, so it was just on the cusp of the financial crash. And there were talks about making a film. They didn't want the project to die, but it was never finished. It was never remade. And as we'll come to in a second, I can really kind of relate to this. So fast forwards from 2007, 11 years. So in the meantime, my friends have all gone out and done different things, and I've stayed in ancient history. I finished my undergraduate, and I did a master's, and I did a PhD, and I was in Scotland, in St Andrews, and I was working as a temporary lecturer at the University of St Andrews. And I got an email just out of the blue saying, we have a writer who is writing some pilot episodes of a TV show on empresses. Are you interested in consulting? And I was like, I was intrigued. I took a follow-up call. The writer's called Simon Burke, who is famous within the industry, and I kind of vaguely heard of him, but not really. And I was kind of on the fence, but what it was sold to me as, it was female-centered narrative. So it's maybe stepping away from the kind of narratives that we've seen with I, Claudius, which tend to sort of stereotype women, the poisoners, the intriguers, etc., though Domina has a fair amount of poisoning and intriguing as well. I was kind of on the fence about this. So I was in Scotland, but I just found out I got this job in Ireland, and I was like, I'm about to move to a whole different country. I gonna have a job, new job. And I was also slightly concerned, what does this work look like? Will I be taken less seriously as a historian if I do this kind of stuff? But I was intrigued, and I said yes. And this TV series, this was 2019 it started. The TV series ended up being called Domina, but at first it had no title, working title. Domina is the female version of a mistress, so slaves would call their mistress Domina. So this is where it comes from, female-centered. And the story is set slightly overlapping with HBO Rome, but very much on the later end of it, and prioritizing different things. So it's set in the very, very end of the Republic, when everything was falling apart. This was a really chaotic period. Civil war, Romans were killing Romans, literally in the streets of Rome. Livia was this character, was this aristocrat, a young aristocrat who was caught up in this. Augustus was originally at this time called Octavian, but he became the Emperor Augustus I, Emperor of Rome, and from that point onwards, Rome was ruled by emperors. So it's tracking this transition period. But instead of talking or focusing on Augustus, it was focusing on Livia. So, and tracing the story through her eyes and actually asking questions about what if she was the mastermind behind some of these genius policies that helped Augustus become the first emperor while claiming to just be restoring the Republic. The first 2 episodes have a younger cast, and they start when Livia is very young. So the first episode opens with Livia's wedding day at 14 or 15 years old, very young, but typically young for that time period, marrying her cousin, again, quite typical for the time period in context. And these first 2 episodes of the sort of the bloodshed, the chaos, she's running away from Rome, she's running to Sicily, and it finishes with her marrying the future Emperor Augustus while she's actually heavily pregnant with her second child from her first marriage, which even at the time was really quite scandalous. And then it jumps forward in time, and it looks at how Augustus established his regime. So how he claimed to just be restoring the Republic while actually making himself a king in all but name. This is a behind-the-scenes shot, which I think I've actually had to brighten this slightly because it's very kind of Scandi-noir. And this is not maybe what you saw with something like Gladiator, which is open and bright. It's dark because Roman homes, particularly at night time, without artificial lighting, were dark. And it's imagining, so we have Augustus here and we have Livia there who's pregnant at this time with their child. And imagining what is happening when Augustus is faced with these problems of what do I do at this point? And of course, discuss them with his wife. So it's imagining these behind the scenes, behind the curtain in many cases, beyond the Senate House, though it has some scenes in the Senate House as well. So my role on this, my role evolved. So early on, it was just me and Simon, emails back and forth, and reading the first 2 screenplays. Simon then managed to sell these screenplays and sell the project to Sky Italia. And then my job kind of expanded. So I was then hired to basically assist this, what became a whole team of script and story team. Firstly for sort of episodes 3 to 5, and then there were 10 episodes. And a year later, after I was first contacted, so it's March 2019, you hear counting down to a significant point here. March 2019, I eventually went to London to do a storyboarding day where they basically worked out what is happening with this, how are we going to turn these real events into a story. This was actually the first time I'd met anybody face to face on the project, first time I actually met Simon. And this evolved, more writing happened, and then November 2019, I went to Rome, which was amazing. It's always amazing, to Cinecittà, the famous studios, which is actually where HBO Rome was partly filmed as well, and went to the read-through. And this is where, I'm not sure if anyone heard of a read-through. I had not heard of a read-through before I went to a read-through. And it's basically where, the centre is the cast sitting around a table reading through the screenplays, but often other people involved in the project are there, and that's why I was there sitting in the back row being like, goodness, this is enormous at this point. But the casting people, the producers, the set designers, everyone is there and they read through the scripts together. And it was a very surreal moment for me because particularly the first 2 pilot episodes, I'd read so many different versions of them. It was so strange to see real people in them. And also Liam Cunningham was there because he played Livia's dad in the first, and I was starstruck. He would not remember me at all, but I was like, oh my God, it's Liam Cunningham, it's real. And he had the whole room with sort of, he won everyone over there. So filming started in the autumn, and then in January 2020, late January, February, it came to a halt because Italy, if you might remember, was very badly struck by COVID very early on. And this was pretty catastrophic for the production. And for my role, what basically happened is they went back to the drawing board for a lot of it. So they ended up cutting the number of episodes. So originally they wanted 12, then 10, then it was 8 episode series. And this is quite standard from now on. If you look at seasons, it's 8. And for me watching it, and particularly seeing the publicity stuff was so surreal. because my job had mostly been with like the screenplays, these texts, and all this stuff had been added over the top. So the sets, the directing, the actors, and it was so much more than what I saw on paper and what I helped with. And at this time, we were also starting to develop season 2, because really you have to get the next season, like a good solid idea of it down by the time that season 1 of anything airs. So if it goes well, you can hit the ground running. And, so I was helping, we were writing the second season, and we were waiting to see the numbers. And then I got the disappointing news. Simon said it's not being renewed. It's really disappointing, but it's been a great experience. And then a little bit later, I think several months later, I kind of got an email, and they were like, by the way, it is being renewed. I was like, wow, amazing. And then it was because it's kind of this momentum builds off again, and I was like, goodness gracious, let's start it all again. And from this point, I never actually went back to Rome again. Everything was very much sort of via email and Zoom. And the second season was released in July 2023. And again, season 3 had been started to develop. We knew where the story was going, but it was not renewed again. And this really was a really interesting insight for me as someone who loves consuming TV but had never been involved in what it means to make TV. And it is so hard. It's such a tough industry, in particular over the last half decade. It's been really tough for everyone working in the industry. COVID's changed everything. The writing strike. It's really hard to get money and funding for bigger projects. And also streaming is one of the main ways that series are being generated now. And it's just a really tough environment. And it made me reflect on HBO Rome and being like, why did they finish it? And suddenly understand, so much stuff gets developed and never made. You can imagine you selling the rights to your book or helping writing something, and it will never see the light of day. And this is really, really common. So I was just so pleased that 2 seasons of it got made in the first place. So I'm going to talk, as I have, mostly about my experience of this. And there's lots of things I could say, and I'm happy to answer questions afterwards. But obviously there is a limit to what I can cover today. But I thought I would cover 2 aspects of this. And firstly, my takeaway on what is the role of a historical advisor or consultant, what's their job? And second, I wanted to summarize, I came down to 5 big takeaways that I took from working on this project. So, first of all, Anna's cousin looking amazing with her crown. What is the role of historical consultant or advisor? Huge variety. And a lot of it comes from the priorities of the production. So, what do they want? What sacrifices are they willing to make for accuracy? How much of a priority is it to them? And the role of a historical consultant, or in many cases, historical consultants, you might have multiple people working on the project, can translate into the final product in lots of different ways. A key one is when in the process someone is hired. So Simon had been thinking about this for a really long time, and he'd done tons of research. But I was kind of impacted by the fact I was brought on very, very early. And it was, as I said, it was very surreal kind of just being there, him and me back and forth emails, me reading what he produced, and then going out to the read through and seeing 100 people who are now involved in the process. But also it's a kind of what attitude is made to, if you have a storyline in mind, are you willing to give it up if the historical consultant says no? Also another one is it takes a long time to develop something. So as I said, early 2018, and it came out in 2021. Does the communication continue throughout that process? An interesting one is Kathy Coleman, who I'm not sure if you've heard of, but she was an advisor for Gladiator. She actually worked at Trinity at the time. She's an expert on Roman spectacle and gladiators, which is why she was asked to be on this. And she did work, spent a lot of time working with the writer, but when she was shown the final product, she asked her name to be taken off the credits, famously. Which within the classics community sparked a sort of
a discussion about this. Obviously, it wasn't going to sort of hinge on her integrity as an academic. She is a well-respected academic anyway. But she felt like what she had worked on and what was produced, that it was not the same, and she didn't want to put her, I think apparently it was too late to take her name off the credits, but yeah. And another one is sort of the extent of their involvement. So what are they expected to advise on? Keeping in mind that no one is an expert on everything. And I did find it quite interesting how sometimes I was expected to be an expert on everything. Come back to this in a second. So for me, I predominantly worked on the screenplays, the scripts. So there were some visual elements in this. So the sort of stage directions, descriptions of costumes. So I had input on that, but I was really quite a step away from the filming. I did answer, I've got some, working in my office, got an email from set being like, would a Roman get in trouble for ordering another Roman slave around? Questions like that. That never occurred to me before. It's like, so sometimes, like during filming, a director might filter a question to me, but really I was working on the scripts. Sky Italia actually hired their own consultant, completely understandable, check my homework. It's just not uncommon. I know that he did some on-set work. I didn't go to a filming, and this was partly because I was working full-time. I just started working here. Being a lecturer is quite full-on anyway. I was doing research, I was doing teaching, I was responding to emails and doing screenplays when they appeared, but I was not on call 24/7. Whereas, for example, HBO Rome, their historical consultant was not a working academic at the time, so his name was Jonathan Stamp, and he studied history at uni, but he specialised in documentary making, so TV, this kind of stuff. And he was like fully involved. He had an office in Cinecittà, so he was very much like on call there. But I had to make it clear there was limited time that I could spend on it. So I got some questions about visual elements. I got some sort of mock-ups of the special effects stuff, like the background, but I only really answered what I was asked. I didn't go through everything beforehand. And yeah, as I said, it's a question of like how their advice is taken. And sometimes you can feel like such a killjoy. Because you're like, can we do this? And I'm like, no. But I actually worked out to be a good historical advisor, you shouldn't say no. You should say, not really, but, and point them in a different creative direction. Or see, like, I can see you're trying to do something like this. This isn't quite right, have you considered this? So it actually becomes quite a creative role in itself. I actually worked out like a traffic-like system of what I did. So red, amber, green. Red was like, this is wrong, wrong, wrong. Some of my red lights could be ignored, but I said it, it's on file. Amber was like, this is not gonna like ruin anything, but we should address this. And green was like little details that, wording, kind of this stuff. And that's a way of filtering it through, so it's never gonna be perfect at all. Kathy Coleman has written about, her experience of doing this afterwards, and I think partly because Gladiator was just enormous at the time, and I just don't think either TV or film makes the same kind of cultural impact now as it used to. I'm not sure if she had the best experience. I had a great time working on the series. I love it. It's been one of the highlights of my job. These opportunities don't come along very often. I'm really grateful that I got to do it. I had a great working relationship with the key writer, though. I think he could maybe get frustrated with me at times because being a typical academic, sometimes I wrote essays in response to like a simple question. He's like, Rebecca, I just asked you this and I got an essay. Can you just answer the question? So my key takeaways about being an advisor. Okay, firstly, academic specialisms are super, super niche. And this really, working on the projects put things in perspective for me as an academic and how, you relate to the world. My specialism is actually in emperors in about 300 years later after this period is set. So I work on like Diocletian, Constantine. Didn't necessarily matter that much because what they were asking was well beyond the scope of a single academic. And it's this kind of running joke, a cliche, which is completely real, that academics focus on a tiny, tiny thing. We have the pie, we have a tiny slice of the pie. And sometimes only a few other academics within our sub-discipline can judge whether we're right or wrong about this, like peer review. Like, last year I wrote a 12,000 word article on a brooch. A single brooch. Yeah, that is it. That's how niche we get if we're asking new questions. But for this, I had to draw on the niche work of so many other academics who've answered these questions, because I was asked these questions I'd never thought of before, such as, how might a Roman wedding have unfolded in this period? Which is harder, because sometimes you might have evidence, it might be from later, you have to... what did the Romans wear in bed? Was a favourite of mine. Never thought about what the Romans did. It's never a question that I'd ask myself, and I was like, wow, I'm going to do my research here. Another highlight was, how might someone realistically fake sacrifice a goat? I'd never thought about that before. Which was really interesting, because in many cases you're dealing with the practicalities of what they can do on set. I was really quite keen on set. There was a fire in Rome, and Simon was like, we are not burning anything. Insurance won't cover us burning anything on set. HBO Rome, famously their set partly burnt down as well. So Cinecittà, there is no fires, go anywhere near it. Another one I found really interesting, and we'll come back to this at the end, is what funerary rites might you give a stillborn baby? And there are people who specialise in these kind of areas in the ancient world. It's not an easy question to ask, because we are based on tiny traces of archaeological evidence. But doing stuff like this, and also doing talks like this, make me realise how important it is to get out of our tiny, tiny little niches and talk to the world. And one of my favourite things about working on this project is it will be reaching a much wider group of people than my work ever will. But secondly, accuracy is not the same thing as authenticity. So as I said, different productions prioritise different kind of things. They have different attitudes towards historical accuracy. As someone who really likes watching historical TV, I love inaccuracies. I was watching The Great recently. I'm not sure if anyone is based on Catherine the Great, and its taglines is an occasionally true story, which I really liked. And it's stated from the outset, this is our attitude towards historical accuracy. It's a riff. And the poster is this, fantastic image of Catherine in a dress that is, the silhouette is accurate for the period, but it's in fluorescent pink. And that really kind of summarises, what this story is about. For the Domina team, accuracy was really important to them. It was a real priority to them. And I could get their frustration sometimes when they were trying to be both constructing a really entertaining story, being as accurate as possible, and also, as the process grows, more and more people come in. So at the read-through, the network were there, and they're like, we want more of this, and things change again. But I am not a stickler for accuracy, and I, partly, when I was younger, I think I could have been bad and be like, that's wrong, and that's wrong. Now I'm kind of like, I wonder why they chose that. Because the whole thing is completely artificial. It's anachronistic. They're speaking in English. They're insects. It's not real. But what they really wanted it for it to feel authentic. And what I realised is, what I found so interesting is it was seeing other people's understanding of the ancient world filtered through what they thought their audience thought the ancient world looked like, coming back to me. So, for example, TV, articles written about discoveries being turned into small newspaper articles about, for example, what happens to infant burials, coming back to me. And I found that absolutely fascinating. But a projected audience understanding of the ancient world is not the same thing as what the ancient world was like. And the true thing is, true historical accuracy is either unattainable or would be completely unwatchable. It would be bad TV, and the worst thing something would be is bad TV. One of the fascinating kind of creative bits about this is, so much as a historian, you say we just don't know. We have, especially as an ancient historian, dealing with stuff 2,000 years ago, these tiny fragments of information, and all the time we say, could be this, could be that, just don't know. When you're making something creative, you can't say, I just don't know. You can't blur that background out because we don't know. You have to put something forward. You have to propose something. And I found that very brave and very compelling at the end. You have to fill in those gaps. Devil is in the detail. As I said, I didn't spend much time on the costumes, which were beautiful. But one thing that struck me watching it afterwards is how, as a consumer of this stuff, your eye is drawn to tiny things that maybe don't appear in the screenplay. So this is an interesting moment. So this is from episode 1. This is Livia. She's wearing a saffron veil, which is what Roman brides wore. And this, appeared in the screenplay. But other things didn't. And yeah, Kathy Coleman has mentioned this as well. And I think this is one of the reasons why I felt a bit far from the final product, is these objects, the sets, the acting, and the clothes, for example. An actor wearing these clothes informs how they would be this character. It's the first thing the audience sees, and it was something that I had very little oversight of. So I think if I was involved in something in the future, I would like to have closer oversight on this kind of stuff. This is me saying, hire me to be, do a Jonathan Stamp job and go there. But this is actually really more important when you would think actually making props is the final thing you would do. It's actually really important for the audience's experience of authenticity. Number 4 is everyone has a job to do. There are lots of people doing their jobs. If you watch the credits at the end of a film or a TV show, you see the amount of people that are involved in these kind of productions. And this kind of contrast to, for example, historical fiction, novels, which is one person's vision of something. They have a lot of autonomy over it, they do their research, but they have control over it. There is so much going on for TV or film. Hundreds of people at different levels are involved in a production such as this, and they have different degrees of involvement. So they might have a few hours involvement, they might have months of their lives, and on that spectrum, my involvement wasn't necessarily on the fuller end. There's the writers, there's the script assistants, researchers, producers, accountants, casting directors. Keeping in mind, in some cases, these change between seasons. So I was dealing with different people in season 1 from season 2, different producers in some cases. The set designers, the costume designers, but then the people who actually make the sets, the carpenters, the plasterers. The sets were amazing. The houses, there were all these interlocking Tetris things that, just amazing. The tailors, the makeup artists, wig makers. The director has a huge impact. There can be many different directors as the season goes on. Sound people, the lighting people, post-production, the editorial stuff, special effects, transport, logistics, and then for the acting, we have all of the, you can see here the extras and the crowd scenes to all of these different people, the stunt people, the intimacy coordinators, there's lots of sex in Domina, the fight coordinators, because there's also a lot of fighting, actors who are in a single episode are ones who are in all of them. So they spent months of their lives embodying these characters, and all of these people have had a part in creating what you see, and all have different understandings of the historical context. They are experts in producing, not ancient Rome. And I really had an appreciation for how long it takes to make something like this, and as I said, how much just doesn't see the light of day, and how also the marketing or the credit at the end doesn't necessarily reflect the work that goes into it. So, for example, a lot of the glamour and the focus is on the actors, but it never occurred to me they are often the last people to come into a process. Sometimes at a read-through, they haven't even cast everyone yet. We've heard of famous cases of actors who've been changed at the last minute. They are the character, but they are sometimes the last step. And that puts a lot of pressure on them as well. When I was at the read-through in Rome, I had dinner with some of the actors who were there, and I asked Matthew McNulty, who played Augustus, how he felt about, the pressure of this, embodying this person, not just someone from the ancient world, but a really famous person from the ancient world. You have Brian Blessed has done his interpretation of this person. How do you do it? Do you feel the pressure? Do you read books about Rome to understand this? And he kind of looked at me and said, I kind of assume that everyone else has done their job by this point. And it really stuck with me, and it struck me as incredibly professional, and also a lot of pressure for everyone to have done their job at this point. Finally, storytelling has an important role to play in our understanding of the past. And this is kind of how this process is reflected back to how I see the past. As historians, we tend to be quite analytical or scientific. So Kathy Coleman, who I said, who worked on Gladiator, reflected on her experience of working on this. And she sort of says, historians, we assemble the source material that we have, we accommodate gaps in it, we try on different lenses, and we do need to take what she calls imaginative leaps. So there is creativity as part of it, but we spend a lot of time saying we don't know. Or I propose this, argue against me. But there are limitations to this methodology, and one of them is the fact that so many voices are lost to us, and this is particularly valid for all historical periods, particularly for the ancient world. Who gets to be remembered or not? Who gets to be written about? Who gets to have their own words recorded or not? And anyone who's marginalised in any way becomes invisible or written over. And Livia is an example of this. We know about her. We don't know much. We don't know anything near as much about her as Augustus. People talk about her. They talk over her. And this is even more the case for all these other people, because there were a huge amount of enslaved people in ancient Rome. And they are in the background of this. They are everywhere. But they made a huge amount of stuff. They were Augustus's secretaries and scribes, and they are invisible to us. And this idea of storytelling being part of history is, as the discipline of history has come back over the last sort of 20 years or so. So there's a historian called Saadia Hartman who works at Columbia, and she works on African American history and literature, specifically quite a lot on the transatlantic slave trade. And she has sort of grappled with this issue of how do you tell stories? How do you uncover the experiences of people who are completely absent from the historical record? Specifically, she was interested in women in the transatlantic slave trade. We have gaps, they are talked over. And she proposes this methodology she calls critical fabulation. And this is this kind of combination between really rigorous archival research and storytelling to understand what it felt like to be in a context like that. And this kind of bridges this gap between the concrete evidence and these kind of imagined contexts and helps us to be imaginative about the past. And this is, in the ancient world, Candida Moss, who works on the New Testament, has applied this more recently. She's written about how people who were slaves had their part in writing the Bible, for example. And she has used this as part of this way of understanding these people who are so invisible to us, but we know that they were there. And this made me reflect on, how this works for me. So Livia, for example. So all of this is about Livia. Sorry about all the text. We'll come back to this. But you can use these glimpses from the past to tell new stories about what it meant for people emotionally in that context. This is one case. So Augustus and Livia married. It was neither of their first marriage. They did not have any children themselves. And one of the questions that was sort of asked to me is why did Augustus not do, he's emperor now, he needs male heirs. He only had a daughter. Why didn't he just divorce her and remarry and secure his succession by having lots of male heirs? And a piece of evidence that I brought to this was something called the Laudatio Turiae. This is a fragmentary inscription written by a man about a woman, written by a man about his wife. And they were it's slightly earlier than this context, but just about the same time, so at the end of the Republic. And they had exactly this issue. So he praises his wife for what happened in this context, because they did not have children. And as he says, she came to him and said, divorce me. So you need to have children, this is really important. You divorce me, you should remarry, you can have children. And he speaks about his anger there, that he was so devoted to her, he couldn't just imagine her not being his wife. And he said, of course not. And as he says, what desire, what need to have children could I have that was so great that I should have broken faith for that reason and changed certainty for uncertainty. So I said, when they asked me this question, like, what, I just don't understand, I gave them the source, and this is something which then inspired Simon's story about what happened as their relationship unfolded, and they didn't have any children. And it was, again, this devotion. Because we know from the other historical sources that Livia and Augustus were really devoted to each other. They married for 40 years. So this is an example of kind of creative storytelling. And now the people who are even more invisible. So we know, so they didn't have any living children. We have one reference in Suetonius, a biographer, saying that they conceived a child, but it was born prematurely. And this became the focal point of a whole episode around this. And it wasn't just around this story, but also all the people who were there behind the scenes for such a painful and an intimate moment. And those were enslaved women in the household in most cases. So this is the scene that's depicted here, which is Antigone, who was actually a freed person. She had been freed from slavery at this point, who was a fictional character that was constructed as part of Domina, and an enslaved woman who was there during the labour and was overseeing in the stream the funerary rites for this baby who in a Roman context never got to be a human being and had the funeral rites of a human being. And this is the final scene here, which was inspired by the work of an academic who looked at infant burials where the tiny, tiny babies are often put in amphorae and buried within the house because they never went out into the world. And so this, again, becomes part of what we see, which you do not hear about from the historical context. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now. But one thing I would just say, actually, really quickly, is actually this fed back into my teaching, because I get my students, some of my students write fiction now as part of their degrees at Trinity, because it has to be rigorously, researched, but creative. So take a piece of knowledge, and create something new to uncover people we do not hear about. So that is something I do, but yeah, that's...
I might ask you, I don't know if you answered that, when you said the director, or somebody rang you and said, are people punished for giving out to an enslaved person?
Or the question I think it was, would somebody order someone else's slave around?
And the answer is?
I was really annoying academic, and I said, it depends on the context. It's a really typical academic answer. I asked about the scene it was in. But yes, it was again underlying the fact that these human beings, who are human beings in real life, who are actors in real life, had to get their head around being treated as something between human beings and property. And I think that was very troubling for some of the actors on set as well. So this idea of how these hierarchies are shown by the actors in really sophisticated ways, gestures or things like this. But yes, it was somebody else's property. So there were sort of lines on how someone would or would not behave in that context, yeah.
Sorry, I hope this isn't an intrusive question, but going from the Republic right up to the later Empire, was there any female character, and I know a lot of them were invisible, but was there any female character with whom you would have identified or would imagine yourself to have been or would like to have been? My male character would have been Marcus Tullius Cicero, but do you have any female character who would say, this is somebody I would like to have been?
The worst answer to that is no. And this is partly because eventually as a historian it becomes a problem. It becomes a system and they don't become real human beings. And this is what I love so much about working on this project, is it reminded me that these were real people. But it reminds me of, I teach a course on the Roman Empire, and we were having a sort of brainstorm in the lecture about what did people gain or give up from being in the Roman Empire, which is always a really interesting discussion to have in an Irish context, because empire means different things in this context to where I'm from. And a student asked me, would you live in the Roman Empire? And I was like, as I am now, no. As a woman, no, I wouldn't. There are lots of people that I admire. Justinian's wife, the Empress Theodora, fascinating character. I just have a lot of frustrations, though. And for example, the period that I specialise on, it's full of men and very invisible women. Constantine's wife, Fausta, who was mysteriously disappeared, probably murdered by him. We don't really know why. I remember when I was finishing my book and I had a bit on her, and it struck me that I was around the same age as she was when she was killed. And male historians have been writing all these stories about, she really didn't get on with her mother-in-law. And I was struck me as like a woman in my mid-30s who has a really good relationship with my mother-in-law. Why would I hate, this idea that women hate each other? I'm like, well, I'm a woman and I don't hate women around me. And it just struck me how we need more people to deal with this stuff, because people deal in stereotypes in modern contexts as well. Yeah. Yeah.
What type of feedback would you get? What type of feedback would you get on literary, on the historical context, content, subsequently when it goes out? Is it reviews, or is there feedback to you about? Oh, I'm not too sure I'd agree with you on that one. Or do you get feedback?
Oh, so I saw reviews of the series. I think by the time it gets to that point, there are so many cooks that they wouldn't blame me specifically. My funny thing about it is just like I was such an annoying person when I was younger, and I was like, oh, I spotted a mistake. I remember getting really frustrated when people would, in their reviews, which they aren't very long, would say, Mount Vesuvius didn't look like that in the first century. And I was like, I do remember answering a question about this. And maybe they didn't do that. I can't remember. But I remember it's so easy to fixate on a specific context. I wasn't blamed. I think this was partly because, funny story, they left me off the credits for the first season. Yeah. And I actually emailed them being like, funny. You left me off the credits. I noticed that you had the midwife consultant on there, but not the historical consultant. And they were like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. And then to add insult to injury, they sent me a Guinness gift pack from the UK, which is a very funny Irish concept, But I was like, get it. But part of that was because most of my job had been done by that point, and there was a whole new producer involved, so it was such an easy thing to overlook. But I found it quite funny. They added me on Internet Movie Database, and were like, we've added you on Internet Movie Database, but I think I'm only down there as the consultant for season 1, not season 2, so I haven't actually watched season 2, funny story. I've watched season 1, because they sent me the box set. I haven't watched the second one, but it's so far away from what I was working on. My job was done in many cases by then, yeah.
You talked quite a lot about the production, all the people involved with the expertise, but when an idea crops up, when somebody has an idea, how do they gauge? Is there any way that they can gauge how, would it be a success? Or did you just take a risk and go ahead and see how it pans out?
I think it's so hard, especially because these things take so long to make. And I think I'm not an expert on TV and film, so from my perception of that, I think the trouble is that it's really hard to do something new, because you get a sense of what audiences want, and then you do that, and so it's difficult to, and I think there was a kind of, Game of Thrones was hanging really heavy at this point, because Game of Thrones was it was revolutionary, fantasy was not niche anymore. Everyone was watching fantasy. And it was full of sex and gore. And this is why I think a lot of stuff that got made around this time is full of sex and gore, because they were like, we need to Game of Thrones it. So this is and this is because there is so much money involved, and there's so much, but you're developing this stuff, it's really difficult to tell, what the appetite will be, and it's a really saturated market at this time as well, particularly because of what streaming has done over the last 5 years. Half of my students haven't watched any of this because they don't have Now TV, and Now TV is really expensive. You know, not all of us, you know, we don't have 5 different streaming networks to watch everything. So it's really sort of fragmented the market. So this is my point. It's like, it's really hard. It's such a challenge for people to make this stuff and to make anything new. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rebecca.